Okay, and so why did I say that the Corn Belt is leaky? So our biggest loss of nutrients is really outside of the cropping system. And that's because when it's the summertime here, during the annual grain summer-dominated system that we have in the Corn Belt, we are pulling nitrogen and nutrients out of the ground and putting that up into leaf material and into roots and into corn and soybean seeds. And so nitrogen, for example, just can't really leave the system because corn and soybeans are pulling on that plant, on that soil, and pulling those nutrients into their plant materials. But outside of our summer-dominated system, we don't really grow anything. We don't grow any winter plants anymore, and so that's when we have our biggest chances for loss. If this was a winter wheat dominated system, winter wheat fallow system, it would just be the opposite graph, but it'd be the same concept. If you had winter wheat all winter long, but nothing in the summer, you'd still have mineralization and you'd have loss. And so when we have a dominant summer system or a dominant winter system without any cover crops in those systems, we're going to have chances for loss. And so why do we have this system that I showed the effects of in that graph? So this is a picture of Iowa's cropping history over the last 100 years. This is the percentage of Iowa planted to different crops. This is time at the bottom. And so whether you can read the legend or not, what crop do you think the yellow is? Corn. So we've grown corn on about 60% of Iowa's landscape for about the past 100 years. Okay, what do you think this light blue up here might be? Oats. So those would be small grains. There's a little bit of winter wheat that was grown in Iowa. And those are winter plants, and they were usually grown with red clover or alfalfa. And those are cool season legumes and a cool season grass grown together. So here in about the 60s and 70s, when we made this major switch from a cool season, warm season cropping system, a more balanced cool and warm season system, to, and what do we think this green crop is? Soybeans. When do soybeans grow? At the summertime, right? The same exact time as corn does. So today, 23 million acres of Iowa's cropland grow plants for about 6 months out of the year. And the other 6 months out of the year, we don't grow anything. And so that's why we fundamentally have soil erosion issues and water quality issues. We need a better balanced cool and warm season system. And so cover crops are those cool season plants that we can stick into that warm season cash crop system. Things like wheat and barley and rye and oats. Those are all cool season grasses. And this is not unique to Iowa. So this is Iowa's cropping history. This is Illinois'. Illinois always tries to outcompete us in corn acres, but we win. I'm teasing. I'm originally from Illinois. So that's Illinois, this is Indiana, and then this is Minnesota. So you can see these same trends. There used to be small grains on the landscape opposite corn, and then today it's soybeans opposite corn, which is a summer-dominated system. So that's really why cover crops are important. And so if you're not from the Corn Belt and you have a winter fallow system that's dominated by winter wheat or any of the winter grasses, then you would need a summer cover crop opposite that to have a better balance of those summer and winter plants on the landscape. So PFI started this funny campaign a number of years ago so that we could talk about why it's bad not to grow something in the wintertime, and so we titled it Don't Farm Naked, Plant Cover Crops, with t-shirts and bike jerseys. I have t-shirts for sale. And so we wanted to have a discussion. We wanted farmers to talk more about why they're not planting something in the wintertime. And maybe think about adding cover crops as a way to work those cool season plants back into this warm season dominated cropping system that we have. Okay, and so if you all don't know what a cover crop is, just in case, it's just a plant that's in between cash crops. It's usually not taken to grain harvest. That's when it would become a third crop, for example. So it's just as covering the soil. So this is a picture of rye flown on into corn up in northwest Iowa, and then this farmer actually brought in a bunch of cattle to graze that down and make a little bit of extra income. Okay, so now I'm going to go through some of our research results. So for farmers getting started with cover crops, and if you're advising farmers out there or you're an agency person and you're working with farmers, we don't want to tell them only the good stuff about cover crops. We want to make sure that we're really honest. And so Practical Farmers of Iowa partnered with Iowa State University to do assessment of the costs when cover crops are added to a corn bean rotation. and the assessment of the revenue changes when covers are in the system. And the responses to this survey were farmers who'd been using cover crops for 4 years or less. And that's really important because when you're new to cover crops, there's a learning curve and there's a lot of things that can be screwed up. And then you could have revenue changes that are negative or costs that are too high. Ken Rulon, who's presenting at the same time right now, who has a mature system, his system, is showing positive gains all the time. And I would say our farmers who have been doing covers for more than 10 years are on that return now. But for those just getting started, they've told me that they're break even or less, and that's really what we saw through this regional survey that we did. So this is a partial budget. This would be farmers who grew cover crops in 2015 ahead of either corn with cover crops or corn without cover crops, and what's the change in revenues and costs from that when they terminated it with herbicides, and then I'll show soybeans next. And so we can see the change in revenue here. The mean is $16 positive, and the change in cost is $36.90 in changes in costs. And those changes in costs obviously were planting the cover crop has a cost, buying the seed, changing the nitrogen program, probably putting on maybe too much nitrogen or extra nitrogen. Spraying for armyworms came up a bunch as an extra cost. And then the changes in revenue probably were decreases in corn yield that affected revenue. And then access to cost share dollars was a positive access to revenue. And so you can see the change in profit. We're negative $20 per acre when a farmer new to cover crops does it ahead of corn. And when we take cost share out, we're negative $46. So cost share is really important to get us over that learning curve, to help us learn how to do cover crops ahead of corn. And we see in the third quartile group of farmers, so those that are doing the best job in that early phase of adding covers, they were at least closer to break even without cost share. So that just teaches us as agronomists or as agency folks, we need to help farmers control costs when they're adding cover crops, especially going to corn, and maybe be real honest about that year to corn, that we could have some revenue issues with yield decrease, and so maybe we don't get started going to corn. Maybe we get started going to beans. So the reason why I say that is because the partial budget of cover crops terminated with herbicides going to soybeans is a real different story. So our changes in revenue, we were positive, nearly $60 on the soybeans, and our changes in costs were about the same. And so our net profit with cost share was $25 an acre, and then without cost share was really close to break even. And we can see farmers doing a good job controlling costs and even seeing increased yields over here in the third quartile group. We're positive $30 per acre. And I've shown this to many farmers in the last 2 months that we've released this study, and they're all nodding their heads that in those early years, beans was really easy to get started with. No issues in cost, almost covering their costs, but corn has been trickier. So for a beginner farmer getting started, maybe just do rye to beans, for example. Okay, so we're gonna go into this a little bit more. So how do we control our costs? So I put this picture up there of David Brandt with his great large radishes. And then I position it next to what we get in Iowa when we fly on radishes. And so not to say that radishes are bad, but radishes are a little expensive, and maybe they shouldn't be always planted in a corn-soybean rotation. Maybe they fit at a different time of the year. So from these pictures, we started evaluating a number of cover crop species in Iowa to make sure that we're planting the right cover crop at the right time. So we've conducted 50 cover crop entries we've evaluated over the last 5 years. And annually, we have about 10 to 16 locations. And we've evaluated cover crops in the grass group, like rye, wheat, barley, annual ryegrass, spring wheat, oats, Virginia wild rye. And then in the brassica group, rapeseed, turnips, mustards, camelina, field pennycress, canola. And then we've also evaluated legumes like hairy vetch, crimson clover, red clover, peas, Balanza clover. I think those are the legumes. And so from all that evaluation, a lot of evaluation of the cover crop species, we really can come down to show that if we're planting early, so if we're harvesting a small grain or sweet corn or something's coming off early, we can plant cover crops from really any of these groups in Iowa. Maybe the cutoff for Illinois, southern Illinois, is like September 20th. Maybe you still have enough heat units in September 20th. south of Highway 74, that you could plant from any of those three groups and really do the 5-way, 20-way mixes and get enough growth out of them. And you've got great pictures of crimson clover to show that we can't really grow a lot of crimson clover in Iowa in this later seeding window. We really need to be early to get good growth off of that. And then if we're late harvesting, because we have corn and soybeans on the ground, and we're going to aerial seed because we want to get brassicas in the mix, then we really can choose from the grass group and the brassica group and have a good stand and have good performance. And so we could use high boys to seed that, or planes or helicopters. And then if we're late, like if we're harvesting corn for grain or soybeans for grain late and we're going to plant post-harvest, then really the grass group is the only choice, and probably north of Highway 80 it's only cereal rye. Maybe south of Highway 80 you could do triticale wheat until southern Illinois, and then annual ryegrass probably could be planted post-harvest maybe up until third week of October, I would guess, south of 74, and still survive, still overwinter, if you wanted it to overwinter. So this can help control our costs. We could spend money up in this first group, $50 per acre, easily on cover crop seed. Rye is about $7 per acre, maybe up to 10 at the high periods of the year for just the seed. So that helps control our costs. Okay, and so I handed out this decision tree, and so you can look at that later. You can look at it later. And so it can just take you through, like, are you planting early or not? Yes or no? And then are you going to do tillage? Yes or no? Are you going to plant into a cash crop with a plane or something? Yes or no? Is your next crop going to be corn? Yes or no? These are really important questions to make sure you pick the right cover crop for what you're going to do with your system. And I'll just mention, although we would love all farmers to really reduce tillage, many farmers use a lot of tillage. And so I feel PFI, we really want to meet farmers where they're at. And if you're in a full tillage system, then we definitely want to work through ways for you to maybe reduce one pass at least and help cover crops work in your system. But maybe you don't have to go immediately to no-till because it's not realistic for many farmers. That's our sort of culture at Practical Farmers. Okay, and then as far as should we do these big 5-way mixes versus sole species, and so we wanted to evaluate at different planting dates whether I'm using a high boy or a drill, and this is the fall biomass of different mixes or sole species versus the spring biomass is on the other side for the cover crops that overwintered. In the fall of 2014, we either seeded into soybeans. This is in the soybean fields. This was 3 locations. This is into standing corn in the fall of 2015 at 3 locations. And the cover crops were either a winter kill mix or an overwintering mix. And so if it was a winter kill mix, it was oats as the grass species in it. So you can see oats, and then oats was in the mix. Or if it was an overwintering mix, then rye was in the mix, and it was either rye and then rye was in the mix. And then hairy vetch, we tested that in the mixes, radishes, and rapeseed. And so from this data, it tells me that planting early is important. So where I have the high boy plots, which would have been overseeded into standing corn or beans, Labor Day-ish, we get more fall growth, which is good for performance, driving more biomass out there. And if we're post-harvest, we're going to get less growth. But then in the spring, we see, we catch up pretty good. We have some decent stands still from the post-harvest drilled cover crops versus the high boy. So we can still plant late, but it would be good to get some on early as much as possible. And then as far as should we do mixes or sole species, I'd say the jury's out. I'd say if we knew we could have good soil to seed contact and we could plant early, then a mix is going to perform better than a sole species. But if we can't do that and we're later or overseeding, the sole species is probably going to be the best economical choice and perform the best. Okay, so what about protecting corn and soybean yield or increasing it? So this is a 9-year study that we've been doing on farm, 6 locations, cover versus no cover. So it's planted in the fall and then it's killed in the spring with glyphosate. And then we go back to corn or soybeans, and then farmers give me the yields off of these trials. And so from our long-term study, in the beginning, as farmers got started doing this ahead of corn, in the first 2 years, we had 3 sites out of 10 have a negative corn yield compared to the no cover crop when they followed rye. and 7 sites were yield neutral. And those 3 sites were negative. One, the farmer could not kill the cover crop. They applied Liberty 3 times to rye and never got a good kill. And now we see the majority of farmers are using glyphosate or Roundup to kill rye in Iowa. And the other 2 times we had a yield decrease was because of the improper nitrogen program. So those farmers were putting on only fall anhydrous for nitrogen and doing nothing on with the planter or in the spring, or some amount of N on at planting, in addition, or moving N from the other times of the year to the spring planting window. But in the later part of the study, 22 times we've had no yield difference, and then 2 times this last year we did have statistically higher corn yields after cover crops were in the same spot for 8 years in a row. So I think that's probably why Ken Rulon's economic data is showing such good returns after long-term cover cropping, because now we're seeing yield increases. And it doesn't surprise me that corn has taken a while to show those increases, since our cover crop of choice is a grass and corn is a grass. And nobody in their right mind would want to do that. But we're planting it in October, which is the only cover crop we can really do in Iowa. Okay, so that just sort of backs up why that economic data could be scary at the beginning. But after we figure out that learning curve, and that's why NRCS cost share is important, while we get over that learning curve, by 8 years or so, we're seeing those yield increases. So we hope to see that consistently now. We've got farmers doing this for 2 more years, and hopefully by the 10-year mark, we'll see consistent yield increases. Okay, so then on the soybean side, it's a different story. Right away at the beginning, we saw 2 sites were statistically higher yields, and those were a 4 bushel average yield increase. 4 out of 6 sites were yield neutral. And then in the later part of the study, 13 sites were yield neutral, 5 sites were a yield increase, and it was a higher increase. It was 6 bushels average higher soybean yield than the no cover crop plots. And then that 1 site that's yield loss, because farmers were getting more comfortable with letting rye grow longer, but not adjusting their planter well enough, we had a stand issue in that site that had reduced stands. Because if we're planting into rye that's much bigger and we're not adjusting our planter correctly, that was why we had a yield loss in that soybean field in that year. Okay, so just a couple more studies I'll go over, and then I'll turn it over to Will and Adam. So now farmers are thinking about pushing the limits, letting rye grow longer. After they've tried rye for a couple years, especially ahead of soybeans, they're really comfortable with it. And so now they want to test, if I kill rye a couple weeks before I plant soybeans or the day before I plant soybeans, what's going to affect my yield? How's that going to affect my soybean yield? So Jeremy and Jack was another cooperator. They've done this for 2 years at 2 different farms. And what they noticed, though, in addition to evaluating yield, was that they could treat those strips that were let go longer with different herbicide programs. So they had really solid weed control from a good rye cover crop ahead of beans, that they could reduce a pass of herbicides. And they didn't intend on studying that, but that's what happened during the trial when they were observing those strips were different. So yield-wise, we were neutral on yield. So this is soybean yield following early terminated rye, and that was about 10 days ahead of time, or yield of soybeans following rye terminated just a day or 2 ahead of soybean planting. And you can see in the green there, we were yield similar across all the sites. But what was different was the cost to do herbicides. And so Jack was able to back off of a pass and able to at least reduce his herbicide cost by $10 an acre, which covers at least half of the cover crop cost, so that was good. And then Jeremy was able to reduce his cost by $50 an acre, which more than covered the cost to plant and purchase the seed of the cover crop. Now you'll notice it didn't happen every year, and they're only in their 3rd or 4th year of doing cover crops, so it doesn't surprise me it's not every year. But this was good for us to realize that our regional survey showed similar results. That is, farmers start using cover crops more. In the beginning, it's easy with soybeans, but as they push it more, maybe they can actually reduce costs enough to cover the cost of the cover crop seed and planting. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. Okay, last one on nitrogen. And this is really important. I handed out a handout that says corn following rye and the right nitrogen program, things to think about. This is where farmers probably get turned off to cover crops the most. If we're using an overwintering cover crop that's a grass like wheat or triticale or barley or rye that would overwinter before we go to corn, and we don't have our nitrogen program correct, this is where we can have major yield loss and where farmers really get turned off to cover crops. We like planting cover crops after soybeans because there's no residue there, you know, it's just really high potential for erosion. And that makes a lot of sense, but then we have to deal with it in the spring if it's an overwintering cover crop. So Dick wanted to do early terminated rye versus day before planting corn terminated rye, and then he had the same nitrogen program across the whole field. And so this is the corn emerging in that late terminated rye, and you can see here, you know, there's just not even much residue left come a month later or so of rye residue. This was in 2016. And then his go-to program, which has become sort of our go-to recommendation, and I've heard many farmers say this similar recommendation, so that's why it's my go-to now, that on the planter you put on 35 to 45 pounds of 32% in a 2x2, or what is it called in Illinois, a side-by-side, or it's got a bunch of different names. So it's not pop-up in furrow, it's off the row and below the row. And then add some sulfur. And so Dick did that program, and then he followed up with 105 pounds of side dress. So what's key here is a very available form of N on with the planter when you're planting into large rye. And so his yields from rye, early terminated is the brown and late terminated is the green. Although they look similar, they're 5 bushels less in the late terminated. And he had a decent amount of cover crop there. I think it measured out to be 1,800 pounds of rye. And so then from that study, he really wanted to do a more complicated test this year. Okay, so now he wanted to check, he just did this in 2017, and I'll end with this study. It's more complicated. So where he had corn following rye, but the previous crop was corn, that's these treatments on this side. And then where he had corn following winter wheat, winter barley, there was a brassica in that mix, but there was no rye in that mix. He had, I'm sorry. There was no rye in this mix. This was the winter barley, winter wheat mix, and this was winter rye ahead of corn, and either the previous crop was corn or the previous crop was soybeans. And then he did low and high nitrogen. And so he did fall manure at 76 pounds on the corn fields, 35 pounds of N, and you'll see 35 pounds of N is his go-to on the planter in a 2x2. And then either did 70 pounds of side dress or 90 pounds. And then in the corn following soybean plots, he had 15 pounds of N on his MAP, and then 35 pounds of N on a planting, and then varied side dress 20 pounds. So extra complicated study. And then he terminated the cover crop either 21 days before corn planting or 3 days before corn planting. And this should not say rye. This should say cover crop, because one was with rye and one did not have rye but was an overwintering cover crop mix. Okay, so from that, these are the early terminated cover crop treatments here, and this is late terminated cover crop. I'm going to help you all learn how to read graphs with stats on them. And then this is either low N here, or that high N or high N rate. And this is in the corn fields that followed a cover crop, and the previous year was corn. And so the big takeaway here is that early terminated is probably always going to be best when we have a winter overwintering cover crop in our system. Whether we can put on extra N or not, you know, we're just numerically, we're going to have higher yields. But if we can't kill it early, at least if we bump up our nitrogen, he was good in that year, so that's good. And then the late terminated with low N, you know, that was obviously an N-stressed corn plant. But I'd say overall his yields were really good. They were much higher than he has a few cornfields that don't follow cover crops, and those were not as good overall as these yields that followed a cover crop, so that was good. And he's really honed in on his management on this. Okay, and then for the plots that followed a cover crop and they had soybeans as the previous crop, wherever he terminated early, he had less yield drag than where he terminated late, no matter what the amount of nitrogen was. And so this was really a function of rye cover crop, which was the cover crop in this system, the rye had gone to beyond 2,200 pounds in the late terminated strips. And so we're guessing that at some height of rye ahead of corn, it probably doesn't matter how much nitrogen you can put on, you're going to have a decrease just because of the amount of residue out there. Now, this is really where university research needs to guide us on this, because our end decision making in the spring on whether rye is here, which this is about 1,000 pounds, or here, which this is about 3,000 pounds, we don't really know, I'd say, what end rate we need to put on. We have farmers saying 35 pounds at planting, followed up by 110 pounds of side dress, but I'd say we haven't honed in on this yet. So all that is just to say, if this is scary and a farmer's nervous about this, then they should not be doing an overwintering cover crop ahead of corn. And they need to work up to that by doing it ahead of soybeans first, seeing how it works, and then maybe trying it ahead of corn. Okay, so my take-home message is I just want to make sure you understood why we're even talking about cover crops, and it's because we have this cropping system that makes the Corn Belt leaky, and I wanted to teach you how Practical Farmers works and then what some of our on-farm research results are, so that we can turn this, which we see regularly across the Corn Belt and is really unacceptable, into something that looks like this.